Assalamu alaikum. Comment allez-vous? Barako. Comment ça va? Ni hao. This is Musa Matt Meacham Jr. signing in on his book reading station, book writing station, his book course writing. Musa signing in. You know, I'm catching up with myself. You know, the things when I'm saying I'm catching up with myself, I feel like I felt 20, 30 years ago, but I look like an old man, which I am. And what happens is, you know, I get into my lectures and I say things and I begin to run my mouth, talk, it just comes out of my mouth. I was looking at the video that I did yesterday, and I had mentioned, I said, look, you said something about the Portuguese, and I just started rambling, talking about something, and I never got to the point that I really wanted to make about the Portuguese. I had mentioned something about the Portuguese priest and the Portuguese priestess in Europe. And I was giving my oration, my dramatic oration. And then I looked at my video. I said, hey man, you didn't even, why did you mention Portugal? And you didn't elaborate on it. Portugal was on my mind. But let me just add a little bit to that oration that I gave yesterday, or in my last teaching broadcast. I mentioned the Portuguese priestess, the Portuguese priest, and the Portuguese priestess. As I recall in my reading, you know, I've written many books, several books, and you know, 74 years old. I'm not a young man, and you know what happens to old guys like myself. I saw myself giving my lecture, and I mentioned something about Portugal, but I never got to the point. Let me make that point clear now, and then we can move on with the class. I had talked, if you were with me in my last lecture, I had talked about the Portuguese printers and the Portuguese priests, or the Portuguese priests, or the Portuguese priestess. The reason why I brought that up in my discussion was that I was talking about the practice of slavery, and that slavery has not always been based on color, but it was introduced. The slavery that we know about in this period of time was introduced by Portugal. I think it was either a priest or a priestess who decided. They said, "Look, let's make all black people, if you're black, that makes you a slave." In other words, the West began to say, look, let's base slavery on skin color. And I think that's how, I think that's how this racialism arose. And for centuries, we've been stuck with it. So that was just something I want to add on. I had wanted to mention it. I thought I had mentioned it in my last lecture, but I looked at my video. I said something about Portugal, but I never elaborated on it. Let me read something from my book, The Emergence of African Drama, and make a few comments about it. I want to finish that book today. So what I'm going to do, I'll do a short reading, and I may or may not do an oration. My oration is basically based on how I feel at a particular time. Let's go down to, I'm in The Emergence of African Drama. This is a non-fiction book. Basically, it's historical. Let me just read a few things here. Let me see, I'm on page 7. Data produced and administered by the former colonialists will be tainted, given to the tendencies of ethnic biases and cultural arrogance. This means that the examiner must be able to wade through the available data with critical perception, knowing that there are fundamental human issues that must be recognized. Once the African intellectual overcomes his shortcomings in regards to his self-outlook, the propensity to gather relevant information about contributory indigenous efforts ensue. Plainly, the issue here is the reassessment of history. This endeavor would mean the rewriting of history and the questioning of prevailing views. In regards to early African Christians, many groups were founded in Africa, laying the basis for the strong African church of the 3rd century AD. However, relative to theater, the Christians in Europe during this period viewed theater as an obscene practice associated with pagan gods, as well as a dangerous diversion in which they were often the victims. Accordingly, St. Augustine stated that stage plays were the most petulant, the most impure, impudent, wicked, unclean, the most shameful, and detestable atonements of the devil. We must keep in mind that it was within the European intellect which inaugurated the modern system of human categorization based on skin color. Also, we must note that gunpowder was utilized initially by the Chinese for cultural celebrations, while the European ventured on means of warfare and human destruction with its application of it. We must get into the mind of the European from a historical perspective in order to understand that which motivated his actions. Europe is set, particularly Northern Europe, in a cold environment, which incited the European to sought warmer climates. Thus, he became a wanderer, seeking better environment for living. When he found the African living comfortably in warmer climates, quite naturally, he would strive to better his own condition. Considering a man's kind basic drive, this European sought methods to acquire that which he coveted. It took several centuries for Europe, actually, to take the lands from the African. But its actions were based on fundamental human instinct. On the other hand, the African had no need or a desire to explore in the same manner as the European, because he had already been endowed with pleasant lands and physical environment. So, when the restless European was able to perfect the Maxim gun, he became aware of the fact that he could kill the Africans in mass murder and literally take the land. Now, how would he justify this action? He disclaimed the humanity of the African. And this would be the reason why he killed the black African. The Moors, who were Islamics, controlled southern Europe for over 500 years. These were indeed black Africans. Prior to Europe's Middle Ages, the Moors were indeed, in every sense of the word, true African. But what were the religious practices of the indigenous African before Islam made its way? Let us agree with the contention held by Western tradition that drama grew out of religion. What were the Africans doing prior to the acceptance of Islam in terms of religion? And how did ritual in religion lead to dramatic performances? According to the ancient religion of the Bulaba, the only God, Amiwaja, Nangila has his origin in no one but himself. But it's the origin of all that is. Okay, now these are African gods, West African gods, pagan gods, gods that they worship, before they were Christianized or became Muslims and so forth. Let me scroll down a little bit. Deriving from the premise that drama springs from the rituals based on religion, it can be assumed that dramatic art forms after the introduction of Christianity in Africa were directly or indirectly affected by Africans' interpretation and expression of Christian thought. But what were the reasons which caused the African, in many instances, to abandon his own ideas relative to religion, to choose a European style of Christianity, instigated by foreign nationals with white skins? During the period prior to the 14th century, Africa was recognized as a continent of civilized virtue, comparable to the rest of the world. And it took another 4 centuries for Africa to be defeated and ruled by European powers. The period between the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century was a time which most of Africa was under European rule. This period was the most crucial development of the modern African political and psychosocial order. It was during this period that periods concerning European ideology in relationship to Africa evolved. Christianity was in Africa long before the aggressions perpetrated by Europe, which fomented the enslavement of the continent. Centuries of intelligence gathered by Europeans, which most of the time was provided by the European Christian clergy, enabled Europe to conquer Africa. It was the institutions of Africa which facilitated Europe's victory. For the African to accept European religious precepts in lieu of his own theology was evidence that he surmised that his sense of theology lacked in substance. Christianity had gained ground after the Christian Crusades, and during the 19th century, Christian Europe had advanced in technological maturity, which gave it an advantage over not only Africa, but also the rest of the world. Perhaps Europe's need to explore emanated from Europe's population explosion, which prompted a European class of explorers and pirates who sailed the seas in search of new discoveries. By the recognition of the religious attitudes engaged by African civilization, the white European visitors embarked on a mission to dismantle African ideology. That's from the Emergence of African Drama. In this book, which I want to start working on this book today. I want to finish it today. I may not be able to do it, but I'm working on this book right now. This book is based on, I would say, several years of research where I was in the libraries. I was finding books at different African universities that all kind of ancient books that were written by, I ran across books that were written in the 1400s. And the thing is, I wrote a book. I wrote a book entitled "The Emergence of African Drama." What I'm doing now is rewriting that book. So it was very serious writing, and I made some very serious discoveries. And the thing is, we'll talk about African drama and Western impact in the course of discussions in this class. But I'm going to have to call this a short class because I want to complete this book. I want to complete it today. This is Musa signing out.